No one can take your power away from you unless you let them. This is the time to be bold.
Definitely a time for bold actions that were taken by these characters, which were on full display in this episode, as the Emperor shows off his new weapon in Desmond Hart, but Tula Harkonnen's own possible weapon has finally awoken, which may even the playing field. It is time to recap and do a scene-by-scene analysis of Dune Prophecy Episode 4 titled Born Twice. An episode that showed us how desperate times call for desperate measures, as the characters draw the line in the sand to take charge into which side of history they want to be a part of, and some characters, for example, like Theodosia, can literally change themselves completely in making this coming conflict more difficult to win for the opposing side. Now, you'll want to stick around for the end of this video where I'll be sharing my theory of who or what Desmond Hart really is. With that being said, let's break down this episode, full spoilers ahead. We open with the sounds of a thumper on Arrakis as Sister Emmeline awakes to seeing a person walking past her room. Now you'll notice the color change from the more natural color to this blue hue, which almost matches the blue from the glowing eyes that has a big presence in this episode and definitely has some connections to Lila. Now Em follows this person to the garden area and she sees this person cut their own throat, and as she turns around she sees herself with her eyes shut. To me, this can symbolize her and the other sisters closing a blind eye to the truth right in front of them. Now this leads to Jen awaking and she finds the others are suffering from the same nightmare, except for Emmeline is missing from her bed. Now Jen finds her in the same place from the nightmare with a knife in her hand as we cut to the center of the hole into a worm's mouth, and the same blue glowing eyes we saw in Raquel's vision speaks out to Em, who's about to cut her throat, but Jen stops her from doing so as it appears that she was sleepwalking without her control or knowledge of how she got there. Which, as I'll discuss a little bit later, this to me is Dorothea trying to speak out to Emmeline. Now back with Valya and her uncle, she looks at the portrait of her brother Griffin on the wall as we see that there is no love lost between the two characters. Now the rumors about Pruitt's death is a big part of this episode and even mentioned in this conversation, which leads Valya to explaining why she's here. As she finally offers them a truth sayer, which is to elevate their family even after denying them 4 times before over the past decade, but the time has come for that to change. Now her uncle doesn't seem too happy and feels she's abandoned them as Valya hears whispers saying that she's not welcome and that she should have never come here. As Valya suggests that Harold represent House Harkonnen at the Landsraad. Now, Harold claims that all he wants is better incentives for the welfare trade, but Valya has Theodosia reveal his true desire, which is respect for himself, but also his house. Now, I actually predicted this in my trailer for a breakdown as we watch as Valya offers to be their truth sayer and assures him a seat at the High Council. Now, sticking with the sisterhood plot for a bit, we see that Tula is hearing similar voices to what her sister did earlier in this episode, as they're saying to her that she's failing to do her part and she can't lie forever. Now, to briefly speak about these voices, who and where are these thoughts coming from? One could say that it's their own voice that they're hearing in their own head, it's their insecurities, their feelings, and their consciousness. Now to me, I feel like this is a side effect after taking and surviving the agony. What if you're left with hearing the thoughts and whispers of your ancestors who are constantly judging and advising you on what path to take to possibly avoid death like the ancestors did? Now Emmeline brings up Dorothea as Tula reminds them of the lie that she took her own life due to grieving of losing her grandmother. Now Tula realizes that Emmeline is using the truth sense on her as they're dismissed, but before leaving, we see Jen tells Tula that the sisters experienced the same dream or nightmare, except that Jen didn't have one, which I find to be very interesting. Now let's start to speculate in the comment section about this nightmare that wasn't answered in this particular episode, and talk about why Jen didn't share the dream like the other sisters and why the sisters had the same dream. Now to me, Jen is not as tapped in, pun intended, to the sisterhood and hasn't really fully bought into their beliefs. It's almost like she's posing as young Valya, as we saw in those flashbacks, that she didn't really believe in the sisterhood, and that can maybe explain why she didn't experience the dreams, and it really leads me to believe that Jen will definitely be revealed to be someone that's going to probably stand up against Tula and Valya between the next 2 episodes. Now to speak to the shared dream that the sisters are experiencing, to me this is definitely a big mystery of this episode, but seeing Emmeline bringing up Dorothea and using the truth sense on Tula, I have this feeling that Dorothea is somehow channeling herself into Emmeline and the others, and again, I think this is because of the connection she made with Lila in the agony. Now back with the Emperor and his family, we see Hart is eating breakfast with them, and Nez doesn't approve of sharing this moment with a rumored child killer. Now in this moment, Nez learns that her time at the Sisterhood will no longer be an option. Now in response, Nez knows that Hart killed Pruitt, and he lets her know that he did indeed kill the boy because he broke the highest law in messing with the thinking machine technology, and he was met with the appropriate consequences. As Nez walks away from the table in disbelief from what her father is allowing, which to me is setting her up from distancing herself from her family, as we see throughout this episode. As we watch the various houses that govern the body of the Landsraad arrive, the proceedings to addressing the recent events begin. Meanwhile, the Emperor speaks with Hart privately, as he's here to ask him if he started the rumors about Pruitt's death. Now, as we watch Hart destroying Kesha's Sisterhood book, we see the Emperor expresses how he thinks of himself as a benefactor of his bloodline as a ruler and nothing more. Now, Hart encourages that the Emperor show those who stand against him with wrath and to use Hart's abilities to put them in check, but as of now, the Emperor declines this offer, showing that there is some sense of nobility within him. From here, we cut to this private meeting between Horace and Karen, who inquire this thermal drone bomb and their efforts to take the power back in hopes that this thinking machine technology will kill the Emperor. Now, it's important to note that during this meeting, Horace calls the man supplying them with this weapon Duri, who's actually an Exian. Now, in the books of Dune, they are known as a machine-based civilization known for producing advanced technology that skirts the boundaries of anti-computer and thinking machine laws. Now, as you would imagine, Duri pose a threat to the Imperium because of who he is and his occupation. Now, I want you all to remember that Duri is one of two new concepts or new types of technological beings or species introduced in this episode, and we'll speak of the other one a little bit later. Now, back at the nightclub, the plan is set in place with the thermal drones as Michaela questions if Kieran is truly prepared for what's to come if all goes as planned. Now, Kieran claims that he's prepared, but the look on his face says otherwise. My guess is he's thinking of one of two things. One is he's thinking about Nez being caught in the crosshairs and maybe losing her life in the explosion aftermath, and the other thought is I bet he's probably thinking of all the major ramifications that can come with resetting the power scales of the Imperium. Now, back with Valya, we watch her leave a message to her sister about the news about Lila's death as she proceeds to share more about where she is and what's haunting her from her past. Now, she talks about a dream that she's having that resembles the one that Kesha has, but she sees a spider on the wall and she stops and breaks this message and notices that Theodosia is in the room. Now, it could be wrong, but it's almost like Valya never really meant for this message to get to her sister, but these were words and thoughts that she wished that she could say, but she doesn't because she doesn't want to show any emotion or signs of needing help or showing any worry, even with her own sister. Now, Theodosia tells her of the rebellion's plans, as Valya will allow those plans to move forward up until a certain point, as she will be the one to stop them from completing this assassination in order to get back in the good graces of the Emperor. Now, this is a high-risk situation because if she fails to destroy this thinking machine technology, everyone in the room, including herself, will die. Valya vows that she won't fail this mission and she will actually reveal Kieran as a traitor and will use the rumor about Pruitt's death to their advantage as she kills the spider on the wall, which to me was a sign of her basically saying that she won't allow anyone or anything to sneak past her. As we watch Valya's plan be set in motion, we see the Sisterhood begin to plant the rumors amongst their leaders of the houses and put in place the Harkonnens be in position to take on the risk to accuse the Emperor of having a hand in Pruitt's death and also filling in that vacant spot. This to me is a great example of just how powerful and influential the Sisterhood can be. Now, we see Harrow is getting worried that he hasn't heard anything back from the High Council about their houses joining, and just seconds later, they arrive. Here, the other leaders learn just how fast the Harkonnens have come up as Mother Superior introduces herself as serving as House Harkonnen's truthsayer. Now, the invite is accepted to join, and this may be the first bit of like jokiness of the show that I can remember that we've seen so far, as we see Harrow whispers good job to his aunt, but he quickly finds out and learns what is required of him as he sees the risk is he's tasked with accusing the Emperor of Pruitt's death, as we see him pulling his aunt aside to discuss this decision. Now, of course, Valya uses her powers with words to motivate Harold in accepting these terms by calling him the future of the family's name. Now, back with the Sisterhood, Tula runs an experiment with the help of Spice to see what the sisters' shared dream consisted of. As they make their connection with their mind and body, they begin to draw eyes and a face. Some even draw a body and a tree and a person fallen. Some draw the sand dunes of Arrakis. All these things call back to Mother Raquella's vision of the reckoning. Now, to speak to these drawings, and in particular the one of someone falling, I believe the Sisterhood are maybe seeing possible future outcomes, and I bet that person that's fallen is maybe Tula or Valya. As we see, Sister Avela tries to stop this, but Tula doesn't allow this to be stopped because she sees this all as a message. Now they notice that Emmeline draws what they believe at the moment to be a well, as the drawings become more uncontrollable and they eventually open their eyes to see the eyes, and again, this goes back to Emmeline eyes being shut in her dream or nightmare, but now they're literally open, as the eyes from the dream are looking back at them, as she says these are the eyes of God judging them, as Emmeline says that the reckoning is officially here. Not to sound like a broken record, but again, Emmeline to say those words just makes me think again that Dorothea has somehow connected to her, because her saying God's watching them and judging them is something we could imagine Dorothea would say based on what we've seen in those flashback sequences. Tula and Avela look over the drawings and realize that they're all different paths, but they're all images that call back to Kesha's dream and Raquela's vision. Now Tula notices that they all stopped at the eyes and that she had no control over awakening them, but it was the fear instead. Now we all know the saying in the world of Dune, fear is the mind killer. As Sister Avela wants to tell the sisters of this discovery, but Tula doesn't want this to cause any more fear. All these lies are just piling up for Tula, and eventually they're going to catch up to her, and this just goes back to those whisperings that she heard about the lies not being something that she can keep quiet about much longer. Now we cut to the Empress, who shares Imperium surveillance files with Hart that show machine dealings that have gone unattended. Now Hart tells her what the Emperor told him about displaying his abilities, but the Empress suggests otherwise, encouraging him to take a bold move. She admits to being the one that spread this rumor about Pruitt's death, and she did this to show the Emperor's power, and encourages Hart to go along with showing just what happens when you disobey the law, and more importantly, disobeying the Emperor, who sometimes needs a little push. As Hart takes this information and has the royal guards find anyone dealing in technology and showing them no prejudice in their actions. Now back at the nightclub, Horace and Kieran indulge in spice to celebrate as Nez arrives, causing what I believe was fair to Kieran because he doesn't want the princess to know what their plans are. Now Nez shares her inflictions of her father being a good man, but also disappointed in her father's decision to having Hart by his side, especially after killing Kesha, which leads her to offering her help and possibly hurting her father and helping Kieran. Now we get this very interesting line of dialogue from Kieran, who mentions his father surviving an atrocity. Now that can mean anything, but my mind immediately thought to what happened in Tula's flashback in killing the Atreides, which brings me to this next question. Would the teen she let go by the name of Albert be Kieran's father that he spoke of? I personally think it is. Now, even though Nez was against them continuing to be intimate, she kisses him, but Kieran stops her and he doesn't invite her to join the cause and walks away. We already know the plans of the rebellion and how Valya plans to stop it, but now we can add Nez, one of her brothers, to join her in calling out Hart and what he's done. Nez uses what I imagine Kesha taught her on how to use her words to get people to do what she wants, as she believes she's managed to get her brother to help her in doing this in front of their father, despite whatever the consequences might be. Now back with Valya and Theodosia, who notices how important Griffin was to her, which is very important for what happens at the end, but we also hear why her presence on this trip was more than just befriending the princess, but it's because her circumstances involves an unknown talent that she doesn't like using that we finally get to see, and I'll be explaining that more in detail a little bit later. Now after all the conspiring from all these parties, it's officially time for all the storylines in this episode to come together at the Landsraad, which has now begun. But before the Emperor arrives, we see Constantine wishes his father luck and doesn't plan to attend in helping his sister as she thought, which could lead to Nez no longer believing that she can trust her brother. As we watch Kieran prepares his plans, we see Nez is looking for her brother. Meanwhile, Harold is called to speak. As he begins to follow through what was required of him, but he hesitates, which allows Nez the opportunity to continue where he stopped, as she accuses the Imperium House and Desmond Hart of murdering Pruitt, as this unexpected announcement causes Kieran to pause his plans. Now Hart takes this opportunity to speak of order as he brings out the people he collected in ties with the Think-A-Machine dealings from the surveillance footage, including Deary and Horus. As we watch, Hart shares his experience on Arrakis with the different predators that are on that planet, as this line of dialogue from Hart is almost speaking to his existence, as he says,
It is terrifying to experience, but when it comes, soldiers rejoice, because they know for a day the beasts of prey wreaking havoc upon them will scatter across the desert, scared of the devil too.
Now, Desmond Hart admits to his crime, but he doesn't call it a murder. Instead, it was an execution for using thinking machine technology, as he reveals the rebellion's thinking machine and sets forth another execution. As he says, no more excuses, no more exceptions as far as the use of thinking machine technology, as he awaits the orders from the Emperor to execute these traitors as the Emperor gives him the go. As Hart burns the rebellions, but also Lord Hagal, who we saw had direct ties with the rebellion, as each of them brutally burned alive in front of everybody in the audience. Now, in the midst of all this chaos, we cut into Hart's eyes, again putting an emphasis on the importance of eyes in this episode. As we're taken to Arrakis, where we see from Hart's perspective from what we saw that surveillance footage in episode 1, where Shai-Hulud consumed him, and we see those glowing eyes appear, which to me seamlessly confirms the connection between Hart and the set of glowing blue eyes. Again, born twice, one of blood, one of spice, which, speaking of blood, we actually see the blood appear on Hart's back, showing the aftermath after what he did of using the power, as well as blood that he left on his hands in front of Valya. Now, I haven't quite made the full connection between Shai-Hulud and Hart, but I feel like his hate towards the thinking machine comes off very scripted. What I mean by that is, I feel like this new reborn version of himself feels almost programmed to hate thinking machines, but he seems to be very robotic himself. So I'm possibly thinking that this reborn version of him is the same technology he hates without knowing that it's inside of him. Again, my theory that I mentioned in my last week's breakdown is that Vorian Atreides is still alive and he's Hart's creator. Now, to backtrack in the scene, Hart leaving the blood behind is the weakness that Valya spoke of earlier to use against him, which leads right into seeing Harold's disappointment of the events, but we see Valya did indeed collect Hart's blood and will examine it with the breeding index to determine who Hart is and where he comes from, a very smart move. Now we cut to the Emperor checking on his weapon and sees the aftermath of what using his abilities leave. We see the Emperor sympathizing with Hart and places his hand on his shoulder for comfort and wants him to stay. It was almost like this was framing the Emperor seeing him as his son, the son that he always wanted by his side, unlike Constantine. Now back with the sisterhood, we see some of them meeting in secret, led by Emmeline, who spreads the beliefs of Mother Dorothea to those who will listen. Now during this, we see Jin overlooking the drawings. Now it could be wrong, but this seems to be setting up history repeating itself. For example, we have Emmeline, who has her own believers now. We also have this resurrection of a character who we'll talk about here in a second, and we also have Jin, who, if you look at all three of them, they're probably going to be posing opposite of each other, which in my mind is setting up the division that Mother Raquel feared back with Dorothea and Valya. Now we watch as Tula goes to speak to Lila and believes the prophecy of the one born twice is her, and she needs her to awake to stop the oncoming reckoning. Now in comes Emmeline that speaks of all the lies of Tula, and I mean all of them. She mentions the murder of Dorothea, the murder of Ori and the Atreides, and her sins have finally caught up to her. We see the walls begin to rise with sand, and Emmeline vows to speak the truth of all the lies to the Imperium. As Em walks away, we see Tula comes up behind her and slits her throat, just as the nightmare had of a throat being cut, but this to me is definitely foreshadowing and maybe Tula's demise. But we end up seeing that this was actually a nightmare that Tula was having, and she awakes to finding Lila has literally broken out of her chamber. Now Tula finds Lila walking, and you'll notice the new set of, you guessed it, her blue eyes, which to me basically resembles the same set of blue glowing eyes from the nightmares and the visions, and points towards her having some connections to being a part of either being the actual reckoning that they all fear, or at the very least being the one that stopped it, as Lila and Tula hug, but Lila is unaware of where she is. Now again, is this seamlessly fully reborn version of Lila, once born of blood, now of spice? Will she have new abilities that are similar to Hart, or is Dorothea puppeteering her and she's posing as Lila and will seek out revenge from the Harkonnens? What's even more important to remember is the fact that she's experienced the agony and knows what Tula and her sister did to Lila's grandmother Dorothea, so will she confront Tula with anger and frustration and want to harm her after knowing the truth about Dorothea's death? Will this once mother and daughter relationship no longer exist? Which in return could be the gateway or result in setting a path path to a new sisterhood led by who's ever remaining after Lila's possible reckoning against the Harkonnens. Now we end this episode with Valya confronting her uncle, who calls her a murderer, and she's always leaves the rest of the family leaving to cleaning up her mess. He continues to push on by mentioning her being responsible for her brother's death and calls her a black hole, which may be a metaphor for the black hole that we've seen in the visions and the nightmares, and Valya being the cause of all the death. We watch as she keeps hold of his medication that he's in need of in this moment, but it doesn't stop him from calling her names and her being responsible for breaking those close to her. He reaches out for his medication, but he falls to the ground and reaches out as Valya tells him if she would have listened to him, House Harkonnen would have been on top, as we watch him slowly die. Now we hear the whispers return as she looks at Griffin's portrait, but here we see Griffin returns in the flesh as she hugs him, as this being the only time we've seen her show any emotion. Watch as he basically repeats the same lines he told her before he died when they were young, and all of a sudden we see his skin begins to turn red and falls off, as we learn that this was Theodosia's special gift that she didn't want to use, as she can temporarily shapeshift, and this was needed for Valya to hear this from her brother in order to get the encouragement she needed from the one person that she truly loved. Now as we can see, this process seems to be extremely painful for Theodosia as she transitions back to herself. Now what we just witnessed comes from the source material of Dune and is referred to, as we know, as Theodosia's gift. They call it a face dancer, also known as a shape changer. Now, they're a sterile race of metamorphic transhumans engineered by the Bene Therax. Now, the Bene Therax were a group of secretive, genetically altered humans who inhabited Therax. Now, their skills are known to be genetically engineered, however, made them effectively a necessary evil. Now, to me, it seems like this process seems like a tool that I could see Valya forcing Theo to use again to take form of maybe Hart or the Emperor himself. Now this brings me to my theory. After doing some more research on this species, it appears that they have these tanks that allow them to act almost like clones, and they can inhabit their subjects or shells' memories and have a very distinct appearance to their eyes. Now the subject that they're taking form of must be dead, so taking that all into account and remembering how I mentioned in this episode introducing new species, I believe this explains who Hart is, and him being reborn is connected to Theodosia's species. Again, I went down this rabbit hole, and this could explain the return of one of my favorite characters from Dune Part 1, and that's Duncan Idaho, but again, that's another conversation for another day. But those watching or listening, what do you all think about my theory that it's Hart that has been transformed into the species and he's actually acting as a clone? Now my thoughts on the episode, getting the negative out of the way first. My biggest issue or pushback of the show and its biggest weakness in my eyes is unfortunately the young sisters and the acolytes and Constantine and even Nez, who I was very interested in after episode 1, all those plots aren't just working for me so far. It's a mixture of a couple things for me. Number one, I'm not really feeling the emotional weight from the younger cast, combined with the fact that obviously the older actors are given more to do in the story, but also, to be frank, the acting isn't nowhere on par to their older counterparts in my opinion. But to be clear, I thought the younger versions of Tula and Valya were very great in their flashback sequences, but again, most of the younger cast and their storylines just isn't as interesting or compelling to me. Now, putting that aside, I thought the crescendo towards the end was really well executed. Having the characters like Valya and Hart all working behind the scenes, all leading to the rebellion failing, which to me kind of speaks, their failure speaks to them not having a true dog in this fight because they don't have a Valya or a Hart a part of their group. But to pull the veil back on Valya's weakness of Griffin and how she weaponized her own fears to motivate her to push herself forward, and paralleling that to Hart enduring the physical pain in order to use his abilities, is a very good storyline to have both characters share in a certain way. Now moving forward, I can see Nez possibly being punished for her stunt she pulled in front of her father and everyone else, and this may most likely lead her to fully joining forces with Karen, and I can see Michaela using both of them under the influence of the sisterhood and Valya. So overall, I was really impressed by this episode. I thought this was another solid episode of television, and it gave us some possible answers to the major mysteries, and I'm really excited to see what happens next. So before we wrap up, please leave all your thoughts and opinions and your theories and your deeper meanings that you all took away from this episode, and of course, keep a lookout for my trailer breakdown of episode 5. Please support the channel by liking this video, sharing this video, and more importantly, consider sticking around by subscribing to the channel and hitting that bell notification. Don't forget, you all are awesome, and I'll catch you all on the next breakdown.